Good evening, I'm Bonnie Kluwater. I'm the Director and Chief Curator of NSU Art Museum, Fort Lauderdale, and I'm delighted to see such a wonderful response tonight. We are here for the opening of our new exhibition, Helhesten, the War Horse, and we are pleased to welcome our guest curator, Dr. Kerry Greaves, for the evening's talk. Kerry's also the curator of the exhibition. But before I introduce Kerry, I would like to recognize the following sponsors. Without their generous support, this exhibition would not be possible. First of all, we are co-organizing this exhibition with the Carl Henning, Peterson, and Elsa Elfitz Museum in Herning, Denmark. This exhibition, which is based predominantly on the museum's collection of Cobra art, which is Copenhagen, Brussels, and Amsterdam, for those of you who might not know, is actually going to be going to the Carl Henning Peterson and Elsa Elfitz Museum in Herning, Denmark, which when I heard the news, I said, well, sending Cobra to Denmark is literally like sending coals to Newcastle. But I think that that's a really important thing to realize, that our collection of Cobra, which is the largest in the U.S. and probably the largest outside of the Netherlands and Denmark and Amsterdam, has such unique works that it would actually be desirable to a museum in Denmark for us to send our collection there. So that's an important point to get across and to recognize how important this is. I would also like to acknowledge the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation as part of the Knight Arts Challenge, who made it possible for us to present the three-part exhibitions. This is the second in these three exhibitions from our Cobra collection. One of the things that has been really important is to recognize that this museum has very distinct collections that define the museum, and that it is important to get these works out there, researched, and available to the public and around the world. And it was greatly to the Knight Foundation and the Knight's Arts Challenge that we were able to do these three important exhibitions. I'd also like to thank board member Linda Marks and her brother Stephen Marks for contributing so generously to our Cobra collection and all of our Cobra-related initiatives. It was their parents, Meyer and Dr. Meyer and Golda Marks, who had the foresight of collecting this period of work throughout much of their married life, and to so generously donate it to this museum. We are grateful for the legacy of your family's collection and what it means to us at the museum. I'd also like to extend my deep affection and appreciation to Berenice Fisher for her support. Thank you to Jen and Dan Lewis, and to the David and Francie Horvitz Family Foundation, who make so much of what we have here possible, and so many of our board members who are here with us as well. A deep appreciation. Now I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that the museum has several support groups here who have made the museum really the focus of their social life, their educational life, their philanthropy. And those include the Friends Group and the Beaux-Arts Group. The Beaux-Arts Group has been a very long time supporter of the museum, and this group has raised over the years so much money for us, and particularly for our education programs. I'd now like to invite 2014-2015 Beaux-Arts President Jody Lautenberg up to the podium for a very special presentation. Jody, please join us.
Good evening. Tonight is just another example of the great things happening here at NSU Art Museum, Fort Lauderdale, and we are so happy to be a part of it. I am Jody Lodenberg, President of Beaux-Arts 2014 to 15, and this is Caroline Berry, incoming President of Beaux-Arts, and we are an organization whose mission is to encourage among children, young people, and adults a more thorough understanding and appreciation of the fine and applied arts. The volunteers of Beaux-Arts have been active for 55 years and have passionately raised almost $6 million for the museum. Many of you may have attended Promenade. Thank you. Many of you may have attended Promenade, Festival of the Trees, up on the rooftop in the past. Community support really is the key to our success. Please support us, attend our events. The money that we earn is directly donated to educational programming and scholarships for deserving young artists here at the museum. Last week, $15,000 was contributed to fund summer session scholarships at the AutoNation Academy of Art and Design. In addition, tonight, Beaux-Arts is happy and honored to present NSU Art Museum with our gift of an additional $30,000. For you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie and Carolyn. I'm looking so forward to working with you this year. And Laurie, it was so great to work with you this past year. And this funding makes it possible for us to present all kinds of educational programs for children at the museum, from the visits from school buses, with bringing the school buses here, to the programs that we do reaching out into the community. Their support makes this possible, and I thank you for the generosity of you and the hard work of all the Beaux-Arts. So thank you, and I look forward to working with you. So, I was thinking before, those of you who are members at the individual level, what is that, $65? I'm thinking, wow, what an education you got this year. $65 coming to all the lectures that we've had, all the exhibitions, the films, the concerts. That's a pretty good deal. So just think, we're just going to keep doing more, and then for those of you with children or who are involved with bringing in children, this is what we're able to offer. And when a group like Beaux-Arts gets together and raises money and makes so many things happen, it really is an extraordinary event. So thank you all for your support. I would now like to mention that we have another exhibition opening next month, From Within Without, the History of Haitian Photography. That opens on Thursday, June 25th. And, when this particular exhibition, the Helhesten, the War Horse, was really in development for the last 2 years. And it's about a courageous group of Danish artists who, under the occupation of Germany, of Denmark by Germany, chose to show their resistance by making acts of modern art, that was their act of resistance. And I was thinking, even though we planned this show 2 years ago, how timely it is. But then I realized, unfortunately, this would be timely anytime we presented it, which ties it in with the Haitian Photography Show, which is the first ever exhibition of the history of Haitian photography. And there's a book that's in our bookstore by Edwidge Danticat, a Haitian writer who lives in Miami. She's MacArthur awardee. And she has a book called Create Dangerously. And the first essay in there, and by the way, this is part of our Read Between the Wines book club series, she talks about how under Baby Doc, and when people who were in the resistance during that time would all of a sudden disappear or be killed, no one was allowed to protest. So people in her village turned to the Greek tragedies and started to enact them, like Antigone, with its story of civil disobedience. They were able to put on the Greek togas and enact a Greek tragedy, and everybody understood its implications for contemporary times, right underneath the nose of their oppressors. So that exhibition of Haitian photography might seem so far removed from the Helhesten exhibition, and yet there's a lot of parallels. And I think that this is an amazing exhibition, and the work that our curator has done, Kerry Greaves, on it has been illuminating, and gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce you to her. Kerry Greaves received her PhD from City University of New York Graduate Center in 2014. Her dissertation focused on the Danish avant-garde from 1934 to 1946. Kerry is the Novo Nordisk Foundation researcher at the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies, University of Copenhagen. I found working with her completely illuminating. I think that her selection from our collection, as well as works that she added from around the world for this exhibition, will be illuminating to you as well. One of the unique aspects of the exhibition is that she reconstructed an exhibition that was staged in Denmark during World War II, 13 artists in a tent, which opened May 17th, 1941. When they decided to do an exhibition in public, these courageous Danish artists, it wasn't in a gallery, it wasn't in a museum, it was in a circus tent. It was part of the way they were able to present their work, be subversive in a very public way. And it shows you their bravery and the extraordinary work that these artists did in very dangerous times as an act of disobedience, as an act of resistance. It's amazing to me how much there's still to learn about art history, even modern art history. And therefore, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kerry Greaves.
Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie. I'd like to thank the NSU Art Museum, as well as Carl Henning Peterson and Elsa Alfeldt's museum in Henning, Denmark, as well as Golda and Meyer Marx and their daughter Linda and her partner Bernice Fischer. I also really want to thank the staff here at the museum. You have made curating this exhibition a pleasure, and you're a testament to your field, and I just want to thank you for helping make this exhibition come about. So tonight I'm going to be talking about, as Bonnie mentioned, Danish art created during World War II. So what I'm going to try and do is both walk you through what happened in Denmark, as well as what we're trying to do with the exhibition. Chances are the subject of this show falls within the realm of what is fairly familiar to you: modern art, abstraction, World War II, Europe. Nevertheless, War Horses truly is an exceptional exhibition in that it addresses several issues that remain relatively unknown here in the United States. Unlike the rest of occupied Europe, in Denmark, modern artists continued to experiment with formal abstraction during the war, and this experimentation played a significant role in the development of art after the war, in addition to our evolving understanding of the war itself. Indeed, the political and cultural situation of Denmark and its inhabitants during the war remains unique. The Helhesten Artists Project occurred at the very moment that American artists were formulating a similar artistic language that would come to be known as abstract expressionism. In fact, the Americans and the Danes followed remarkably analogous trajectories, with artists on both sides of the Atlantic fully developing spontaneous gestural abstraction by the end of the war. Yet for all their parallels, Helhesten introduces several exceptional and surprising facets into our current understanding of mid-century abstraction and cultural activism. Just how and why did a small group of young Danish artists create a seemingly carefree and happy art during Nazi occupation? Why does it matter? It is precisely these questions that the exhibition addresses, almost exactly 75 years after the German invasion and 80 years after the British liberation of Denmark. If we take this scene, for example, we can begin to see the richness of these seemingly childlike and simplistic images, which, like so many of the works in the exhibition, gradually reveal manifold meanings the more we look at them. This drawing of the Helhest, or Hell Horse, which I will talk about more in a moment, was made by Danish artist Robert Storm Peterson for a 1943 cover of the Helhesten art journal, and it's an astute reflection of the Helhesten venture. Storm Peterson depicts the Hell Horse, which is a folkloric messenger of death, as a darkly comical skeletal dragon immersed in a sea of laughing faces, children, and animals. During the same period as this image was made, National Socialists were aggrandizing similar mythological and folkloric symbols to justify their racist ideology. In this 1939 poster for the Danish Nazi Party, for example, the party exploited Denmark's cultural heritage by linking itself to the Viking era, here represented by an idealized Viking warrior blowing a Bronze Age lure, several famous examples of which were on display at the National Museum in Copenhagen. In contrast to the Nazi heroicizing of such cultural symbols, the artists associated with Helhesten used them to destabilize rather than justify power hierarchies. If we again focus on Storm Peterson's cover, we can see that behind the Hell Horse, the artist depicts himself, here, recording the scene in front of him. Like the Helhesten artists and the project of implicit resistance they undertook during the occupation, the artist lets us know that he actively bears witness to the grotesquely absurd events unfolding around him. In addition, Storm Peterson was much older and not really associated with the Helhesten artists, but he had early been involved with Dada and an actor, and he had become Denmark's beloved national satirist. The fact that he was invited to contribute a cover for an avant-garde journal in 1943 attests to the group's penchant for openness, inclusion, and nonpartisanship, all characteristics that were dangerously anathema to the Nazi Party dictates, as well as the stricter policies of more established avant-garde movements such as Surrealism. So who and what was Helhesten? Helhesten was a collective nexus of artists who made art, exhibited, and published a journal together throughout the duration of the German occupation of Denmark. Named for the three-legged hell horse, the messenger of death of Nordic and Germanic folklore, the group was comprised of the most important Danish modernists of the period, including Asger Jorn, Eiler Biela, Henry Heerup, Egil Jacobsen, and Carl Henning Peterson. Most of these artists had visited or trained in Paris and Germany and were acutely aware of the latest artistic developments in Europe and understood art to be a mode of cultural activism. During the occupation, the Danes reformulated certain stylistic traits of German Expressionism, Dada, and Surrealism into what they called a living art or a new realism. What emerged was a purposely unskilled, brightly colored aesthetic that was manifested in semi-figural, painterly abstraction for some artists, or a naive style for others. Both approaches were humorous and disarmingly childlike on the surface, but as our exhibition demonstrates, they were also trenchant, critical, and sophisticated. Helhesten was established in a specific historical moment, which also stimulated its development, World War II. In April 1940, in spite of a mutually agreed upon non-aggression pact, Germany invaded Denmark. The occupation would last the entirety of the war, more than 5 years, from April 9, 1940 through May 5, 1945. The two countries share not only land, but also a very old cultural and political history, making Denmark's relationship with its southern neighbor especially precarious, complex, and highly charged during the war. Initially, Germany and Denmark agreed to what was known as a policy of negotiation between the two countries, which the Danish government undertook to prevent a violent overtaking of its weak military forces. The relationship between Germany and Denmark grew steadily more unacceptable to the Danes as the war went on. Yet during the first half of the war, conditions were fairly comfortable. Danes lived in relative freedom, including Danish Jews. And by 1943, however, animosity towards Germany grew, and resistance activities greatly escalated. Control of Denmark was transferred to Heinrich Himmler, and in defiance of Hitler's order to deport the Jewish population, Danish citizens were to transport almost all of the country's 8,000 Jews to neutral Sweden. These are the general facts, but they need to be further unpacked. When Germany invaded Denmark in 1940, it was met by only 2 hours of Danish armed resistance. Even so, this moment continues to serve as a prescient event in Danish history, and I show you just a museum or a movie poster for a movie that just came out 2 months ago called April 9th, documenting what happened during that 2 hours. So it still remains a very, very important moment in Denmark. The German commandant of troops in Denmark ordered the Danish army and navy to, quote, show a spirit of understanding by desisting from any passive or active resistance, end quote. Later that day, Denmark's King Christian X and Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning responded to this misleadingly benevolent command, declaring, quote, the Danish government has, under protest, decided to adapt its policies in accordance with the occupation which has taken place, and consequently to proclaim the following. It is the duty of the population to refrain from any resistance to German forces. The Danish government will attempt to safeguard the Danish people and therefore encourages the population to remain calm and restrained towards these conditions. Peace and order must prevail in the country, and loyal conduct must be exercised towards authority, end quote. The king's measured acceptance speech veiled a deep sense of effrontery that reflected the general attitude of the entire nation. On the condition of the Danish attitude of cooperation, German officials claimed that they would, quote, respect Danish sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as neutrality, end quote. The Danish parliament and coalition cabinet continued to function more or less as it had before, maintaining much of its control over domestic policy. So both the king and the government remained functioning during the first half of the war. Denmark's king was just one of a few leaders of an occupied nation to remain in power within his own country during the war, and he became the most prominent symbol of national unity, which all sides tried to exploit, with one leader of the resistance later writing, quote, when war reached Denmark, one dropped everything else and embraced Danish patriotism. And Danish patriotism's symbol was King Christian X. Despite his initial pronouncement, the king was very cool towards occupying forces. He resumed his daily horse riding through the streets of Copenhagen 2 days after the occupation, and the solitary, unguarded rides were interpreted by many as a sign of passive resistance not to surrender. This image only intensified in 1942 during the so-called telegram crisis, when the king replied tersely to a flattering birthday telegram from Hitler, infuriating the German leader, who immediately recalled his German ambassador and expelled the Danish ambassador. The latitude given to Denmark during the first half of the war was due to Hitler's view of the country as a model protectorate, that is, a case study for the occupation of a Nordic Aryan race, as well as the fact that Denmark held little strategic use for the German campaign. By 1943, growing animosity towards Germany led to increasingly violent resistance efforts that aroused even greater public acts of defiance, to which Hitler retaliated by enforcing more extreme restrictions such as martial law, a curfew, disarming of the Danish army, death penalties for sabotage, and stricter censorship. Thus, as we hope to demonstrate with the exhibition, contradictory ideas about Denmark's role in the war, either collaborator or resistor, are inaccurate and belie the complex and chaotic realities of the war, as well as the situation of everyday people. When compared to the atrocities experienced by other countries, one would not be remiss in thinking that Denmark had a relatively good war. In actuality, the Danes were living in a very real and threatening environment. To be sure, the stakes were high for a group of committed communist artists who also partook in resistance activities. And I would just like to mention that these artists were communists. We have to think back to the 1930s when this linked them to an international avant-garde, the French surrealist André Breton. All of these artists were communists at the time. And these artists believed in communism as a kind of egalitarian, utopian construct that they saw as the opposite of the conservative social democratic government, as well as fascism. Their establishment of a progressive art journal took on considerable urgency as a gesture of artistic freedom during the occupation. In defiance of the collaborative policies of the Danish state, which were being only privately questioned in 1941, Helhesten published its first issue, and this makes it one of the first implicitly resistant publications of the occupation. And I just show you this graph here to show what I'm trying to get at is this is the first part of the war when Danes were not resisting openly, and Helhesten was published during this first part, so it's very important. Helhesten's 12 issues from April 1941 to November 1944 included contributions by artists as well as scientists, archaeologists, psychologists, and poets, and featured essays on art theory, non-Western artifacts, literature, poetry, film, architecture, and photography, together with exhibition reviews and profiles of contemporary Danish artists. Article topics spanned high and low art, from prehistoric Scandinavian rock carvings and Japanese kabuki theater to vernacular architecture, contemporary film, and the kitsch art forms of tattoo artists and Hollywood pinups. Artists wrote profiles on one another as well as contemporary international figures such as Jack Meddy, Klee, Rimbaud, and Kafka. The first Danish translation of his work actually appeared in Helhesten. While almost every article in the journal questioned established systems of power and the cultural products they engendered. Throughout the pages of Helhesten, artists repeatedly reconfigured notions of identity as a way of questioning the political and cultural power structures that gave rise to them. The artist chose as the journal's ideological symbol the Helhest, which artist Asger Jorn suggested as, quote, a quite excellent name to flaunt under the noses of the Nazis, end quote. The hell horse was a three-legged harbinger of death in Danish folklore and written about in the tales of Hans Christian Andersen and the Grimm brothers. While alluding to the steed King Christian X rode unaccompanied through Copenhagen, as well as the German expressionist group the Blau Riders' celebration of St. George, Helhesten's articulation of the hell horse was a redemptive one, promoting it as a ridiculous creature, an agent of transformation that satirized and mocked the Nazi threat of death, thus rendering its power impotent. In the exhibition, we have not only all of the journals on display, we also have provided their entire contents in iPads so that you can go through them and see them, and as well as English translations of 5 or 6 of the key texts that they wrote. We also present Carl Henning Peterson's remarkable set of drawings of the folkloric beast. Peterson repeatedly returned to the subject of the hell horse during the occupation. Here, his purposely unskilled drawings convey the creature as a distorted insect-like being, and through distortions, emphasize its life-taking power as ridiculous. Asger Jorn's Helhest, meanwhile, betrayed the artist's penchant for the transgressive aspects of the gestural mark, with erratic scratches suggesting the chaos of war in the tradition of the war portfolios of Francisca Goya and Otto Dix. Also, it was a response to Picasso's Guernica, and this print is one of 23 provisional etchings Jorn made during the war. By the late 1930s, nearly all of the individuals associated with Helhesten had visited Paris via Germany, where they saw German expressionist works and came into contact with the leading surrealists of the time. While Expressionism's interest in Nordic identity, myth, and the spiritual in art influenced the Danish artists, they were very much shaped by Surrealism's experimentation with the creative possibilities of psychic automatism. Above all, Danish artists identified with mainstream Surrealism as a way of life that could battle aesthetic conservatism, political dogma, and cultural stagnation. The first gallery of the exhibition displays artists' early creative experiments with automatic drawing, such as Elsa Alfeld's fracturing of compositional space through the repetition of an uninhibited fluid line. Alfeld was doubly unique as one of the few female artists associated with Helhesten, and because she remained committed to complete abstraction throughout her career. Icelandic painter Svavar Gudnason, meanwhile, utilized the unplanned line to imply womanly curves in this untitled work from the 1930s. Undoubtedly grappling with the rigorous constraints of the formal considerations he learned while studying under French painter Fernand Léger in Paris. This composition is not wholly accidental, but anchored to the center of the image. Asger Jorn began exploring automatic drawing in a variety of media while living in Paris on and off from 1936. While there, he was particularly inspired by the biomorphic abstractions of Hans Arp and Johan Miro. In 1939, Jorn partnered with the French poet Genia Katz-Rachmann in the first of many collaborative book projects he would undertake throughout his life. He translated Rachmann's The Girl in the Fire into Danish, illustrating the poems with elegantly simple and fluid forms. NSU Art Museum's original drawings served as inspiration for the slightly modified graphic illustrations in the book, where text and image share equal responsibility in the narrative. The second and largest part of the exhibition focuses on the Helhesten artists' work during the occupation. Building on their surrealist beginnings, the Danes would shift from surrealist interiority and automatism towards a more spontaneous art making that promoted humanistic openness and emphasized viewer involvement. We can see this dramatic shift in the works by the same artists from just a few years later. While Alfeld began producing compositions of surging kaleidoscopic prisms reminiscent of glacial landscapes, Gudnason's rhythmically colorful abstract compositions recall fantastical landscapes comprised of thickly applied brushstrokes. Jorn's beings began to multiply into all-over webs of floating and interpenetrating shapes that found their way to everyday objects such as this wooden barrel. In a 1939 essay entitled The Creative Process, Jorn invited viewers to freely interpret the different shapes they saw in works such as this, stating, quote, "Look at my pictures and add new values to it, just as I add new values to it every time I see it. Build up a new picture that is completely your own," end quote. Artists hoped that by actively engaging with the imagery, viewers would discover new thoughts and ideas that they could possibly bring to their own daily lives. The viewer's identification with recognizable shapes and symbols, however fleeting, cultivated the potential for a participatory creative interaction with the work. Helhesten's pursuit of an integrative, transformative, creative experience for both artist and viewer materialized into an actual environment in the group's 1941 exhibition entitled quite literally 13 Artists in a Tent, which took place in a carnival tent in Dyrehøje, a park north of Copenhagen. And actually, they opened that exhibition, it'll be 74 years to the day tomorrow. So we're very excited to be opening today and tomorrow. As a physical intersection of three of Denmark's most popular summer recreational destinations that were literally and figuratively a great distance from the hermetic Copenhagen art world, the artists hoped to create a more visible profile with the general public. At that moment, the exhibition could not have been situated in a more widely visited place in all of Denmark. An 11 square kilometer open-air park, Dyrehøje is a Danish archaeological site and had served as hunting grounds for 17th century Danish royal rulers. And I just point out here, this is where I think the exhibition took place. This is the beach I'm going to talk about in a moment, and you can see it's north, just north of Copenhagen. And this is Bakken. It's still there today, the world's oldest amusement park. By 1941, however, Bakken was better known as a destination for Danes who wanted to try their luck at this amusement park, the Hill. Also, Bakken means the hill in Danish. in English, the world's oldest amusement park. Bakken is known for its tented game spaces, and with its long history of working-class entertainment, it is considered a more affordable local alternative to the famous Tivoli Pleasure Gardens. Bellevue Beach, whose beautiful view, the name of the exhibition directly referenced, is located on the Øresund coast across the street from Dyrhavet, and at the time was the most visited beach in Denmark. Thus, as an all-encompassing locus of the multiple signifiers of Danishness, Dyrhavet was an ideal place for Helhesten to engage with the general public. With such a strategic location, the artists hoped to expose and sell their works to as many people as possible. Historically, scholars have stated that only 30 people visited the show, but last year I found a contemporary newspaper article that stated more than 2,400 people attended the opening weekend alone. Maybe we can match that this weekend. The exhibition's environment was playful and socially inclusive, and in its attempts to merge art and life, it was the first truly avant-garde exhibition in Denmark. We are recreating it here for the first time. Artists and their families interacted with viewers in an integration of play as a critical practice in the public realm, creating a kind of magic realm that was separate from the overly controlled yet unpredictable reality outside. The environment within the tent was social, where impromptu discussions no doubt erupted over bottles of beer, while the artists' children wandered and played among the art objects. Each exhibitor had a different role in setting up and maintaining the show. They took turns sleeping in the tent to safeguard the artwork. Visitors to the tent, some of whom were recorded as visiting dressed only in their bathing suits, could meander throughout the space and interact with the artists, who also offered free tours of the park to guests. The emphasis on social interaction, belonging, and community was crucial during the isolation of the war, and as a creation of a collective art space representative of common goals, the exhibition was a liberating force for creativity and an act of cultural transgression during the occupation. Visitors entered this striped marquee via a wooden footbridge made by Finn Juhl, who was a leading proponent of modern Danish design, and would go on to design the Trustee Council Chamber of the United Nations headquarters in New York. At each end of the bridge, large discs of garish colors, which were painted by Elsa Fischer Hansen on site, recalled the country games parkgoers could play at nearby Bakken. In the tent's entry space, enlarged reproductions of Helhesten journal covers hung on the walls next to childlike writing that advertised the journal. The haphazard arrangement, like the humorous and fantastically abstract works inside, recalled the Nazis' 1937 Degenerate Art Show in Munich. That show, which still remains one of the most highly attended exhibitions in history, condemned modern abstract art as degenerate and inherently defective. Helhesten artist Henning Peterson had actually seen the exhibition's installation in Frankfurt in 1939. He had been forced to walk back by foot from Paris to Denmark via Germany because the roads were closing. And he wrote, that was my first encounter with German expressionism. I was obviously anti-Nazi, and I felt myself to be in solidarity with those people Hitler wanted to wipe out. The exhibition was of primary importance to me. Although war was still a fantasy, you felt that it was really in preparation there. Undoubtedly, that famous exhibition played a deeper role for me than I realized at the time. Up until then, it had been Cubism which attracted me, but having seen the exhibition, Expressionism began to fascinate me. There were greater possibilities in it for sensitivity, and I wonder how I could have continued to paint if I hadn't seen that exhibition. I have never visited any other exhibition which impressed me so much. Some of the pictures are still living in my memory, end quote. In opposition to the Degenerate Art Show's use of humor and unorthodox installations to condemn abstraction, the Helhesten artists used these very elements to create a more authentic and intimate viewing experience for visitors. Indeed, the tent's impermanence and multi-purpose use lent the exhibition space an organic and quotidian quality that emphasized social belonging, playfulness, and fun. Paintings and sculptures conjured themes that related to the vernacular and ethnographic subjects, abstract art, and popular culture, which worked to restore the positive aspects of the primitive that the Nazis were attempting to eradicate. Icelandic sculptor Sigurjón Ólafsson's works Desire and Dragon were both in the show. Desire was influenced by Hans Arp's biomorphic sculptures, which he had seen in the 1930s. And I show you here, this is where it hung on the show. And in this work, actually, until recently, was continuously misattributed to being by Hans Arp in the literature. The softly swelling organic shapes reflect Ólafsson's devotion to nature, while their hovering in relief format recalls the artist's admiration for the Bauhaus tenets concerning the activation of surfaces and planes. Dragon, according to Ólafsson himself, was created in response to the rise of fascism. It consisted of a biomorphic beast about to penetrate and destroy two figures. Although the original dragon is now lost, War Horses displays for the first time the recently rediscovered maquette for the sculpture, which features the embracing couple in a reduced anthropomorphic vocabulary. NSU Art Museum's bust by Eric Thomason was most likely included in the exhibition as well. The natural and tactile forms of Thomas's abstracted figures are characteristic of his work, such as these three totem figures here, which summoned associations that ranged from prehistoric objects to tribal totems. The tent shows sculptures with their natural materials and human scale infused the exhibition with ideas about the basic humanity shared by all people, inviting viewers to contemplate the art forms of cultures removed in time and location from war-torn Europe. 13 Artists in a Tent documents an early turning point in the Helhesten artist's work, from the surrealist-inspired images of the late 1930s to the emphasis on fantastical beings and landscapes and spontaneous gestural abstraction that would later characterize Cobra. Egil Jakobsson's Grasshopper Dance and Icelandic painter Svavar Gudnason's Midsummer Night's Dream were both in the 1941 show. Helhesten journal editor Robert Dalman Olsen described Grasshopper Dance in the journal as, quote, two animal humans. Their green bodies harmonize the green world they live in. Only their red eyes stand out and look out at the viewer puzzled. We are new and excited, they say, because we have only recently been born. So we have the right to rejoice of life, end quote. Like the title, which refers to the insect's mating ritual, Dalman Olsen emphasized their verdant nature and fertility. These creatures' fantastical cosmos mirrored the wondrous space of the tent and suggested different realities viewers might contemplate inhabiting. Yet Jakobsson deliberately presented ambiguous ideas in his images during the war, giving them double meanings that pair happy and sad, light and dark, and fun and serious elements. The title perhaps also refers to the derogative nickname that the Danes gave to German soldiers during the occupation, presumably because of the green in their uniforms. In this context, the figures suddenly seem to be in peril, running within a frenetic and disturbed scene. Gudnason, on the other hand, was more concerned with pure abstraction. This rhythmically abstract composition, like much of his work, recalls a fantastical landscape and lush forests that also relates his images to the abstract works of Vasily Kandinsky, with whom Gudnason was extremely familiar, and several of the Helhesten artists met Kandinsky when they were in Paris. Several of the works included in War Horses are characteristic of the aesthetic on display in the tent and represent the stylistic developments the Danes made during the war. Elsa Elfelt's Points Reaching for the Sky, with its luminous, prismatic composition, reflects the artist's preoccupation with an abstraction that was simultaneously contemplative and full of unbounded energy. While Elfelt remained dedicated to complete abstraction, Henning Peterson was the Helhesten artist who was most committed to creating scenes of fantastical bestiary and mythical worlds, which he developed from vernacular folktales, popular myths, and his imagination. Egil Jakobsson described Peterson in Helhesten in 1941 as a painter of fairy tales, whose work was, quote, life in itself, as fables are in our culture. It is a bridge over prejudice and anxiety, stupidity and dark forces. So the picture, too, becomes an independent world, open and full of meaning, end quote. Although Peterson's work appears unskilled, naive, and childlike on the surface, there are always more serious and critical aspects to his images. While this untitled work evokes grotesque humor, this here, Imploring expresses a deep foreboding and unease. The creation of fantastical worlds and beings undoubtedly took on a redemptive and compensatory function during the occupation for these artists. The mask is a recurring motif in the Helhesten artist's work, and War Horses showcases several examples. Initially introduced by Egil Jacobsen in 1936, the mask emerged neither as a subjective reflection of the artist, nor as a mere appropriation of so-called primitive art forms, but a channel of communication, identification, and association with the viewer, as well as an armature with which to experiment formally, and a springboard for the visual exploration of fantasy. The Danes' interest in the mask was stimulated by African, tribal, and folk art, which the artist saw in private collections during the occupation, as well as the newly reopened ethnographic collections of the National Museum in Copenhagen and the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. Asger Jorn developed the surrealistic use of archetypal imagery, such as eyes, but in works such as Mask, these forms give rise to more creaturely associations that were once familiar and easily identifiable, as much as they were avenues of fantastical imagining. The most prominent feature of this remarkable work is the heave and sensuous flux of the paint, which establishes its own physical presence across the surface, threatening to become independent of the composition and signaling the hand and creative process of the artist as an individual creating actively and freely. Artists' exploration of a spontaneous release resulted in the free application of thick paint, whose very materiality could stimulate the imagination. Such a creative emancipation, the artist maintained, facilitated art's ability to relate to viewers. For the Danes, the exploration of fantastical forms was always harnessed to everyday life as it was lived and experienced by real people. Henry Hirup's style eschewed abstraction in favor of childlike scenes filled with personal but also universally recognizable symbols. Oops. Hirup was an artist of the people who represented himself as Denmark's artist elf, who lived with and for his art throughout his life. From his garden in a Copenhagen suburb, he created thousands of paintings, assemblages, and stone sculptures, selling his work directly from the garden to everyone from village neighbors to royal princes. He mined sources from Nordic mythology, Viking decoration, folklore, and everyday life, from which he developed easily recognizable symbolic motifs and interlinking organic forms. Although at first Hirup's naive, naturalistic image seems to be at odds with the Helhesten artist's abstract aesthetic, his emphasis on bright color, the fusing of ordinary and imaginary forms, and focus on humanistic commonalities made him an integral and like-minded force in the group. At the end of the occupation, Hirup made a number of canvases devoted to the subject of the war. The most important of these, War and Peace, presents a scene of military conflict and pastoral peace, with the artist himself riding on a bike toward his young family, who reside in a bloom on the peaceful side of the composition. The binaries of the scene, good and evil, fertility and decay, dark and light, coexist on either side of an everyday farming pitchfork that doubles as a golden mythological trident. The aforementioned works not only bear witness to the evolving nature of fantastical subject in the artist's work and their spontaneously derived aesthetic, they also document how flagrantly these artists challenged the restrictions imposed by Nazi-endorsed art. To be sure, through their images, these artists challenged racist propaganda and its conception of Volk, caricatured the idealized Aryan body, defied Hitler's attempts to assert a common Nordic heritage, and critiqued the National Socialist obsession with historical continuity and order. For its part, the impermanent, impromptu, nature of the tent was anathema to the grandiose, monumental, and overpowering nature of Nazi architecture. In fact, the festive space of the tent alluded to the overturning of established hierarchies and norms that occur during Carnival, inviting viewers to embark on an interactive process of creative discovery and personal playfulness that could bring about greater self-understanding and human connection. In its pluralistic approach to experimental art, utilization of the collective, and aspirations for cultural intervention, the tent exhibition also served as a prototype for artists' later work in the post-war avant-garde groups Cobra and the Situationists International. Although the Helhesten artists' activities were covered widely in the mainstream press, their activities weren't taken seriously. The absence of any substantial critical attention probably benefited Helhesten in avoiding German censorship. It is astonishing that except for a request by the Danish police to be sent a copy of the journal and some censored personal letters between the artists, I found no evidence that the group met with any official interference from the German or Danish Nazi parties. This is especially chilling when one realizes that by 1943, involvement with a resistance publication could mean execution. Nevertheless, the Helhesten artist's abstraction had been labeled degenerate by artist, critic, and member of Denmark's Nazi party, Gudmund Hense. Hense's article, entitled Degenerate Art, appeared in the Nazi newspaper Fatherland in 1942 and was illustrated with a drawing by Helhesten artist Eiler Biele. In it, Hense described the style of such art as, quote, spiritless nonsense, which belongs to no homeland, and which National Socialism will take with a firm hand and cast into the fire like the weeds they are in the garden of art, end quote. It seems that in Denmark, the Nazi view of Helhesten's abstraction was one of incomprehension and contempt, backed by the confidence that the general public would not take seriously the group's cartoon-like aesthetic. But here we are. The third and final section of War Horses highlights the Helhesten artist's activities at the end of the war and directly after. In 1945, the Helhesten artists came together one last time to try and define what they had been describing up until that point as a kind of fantasy art or living art. Amidst Denmark's violent resistance efforts and German retaliation, followed by the country's emergence into post-war peace, the artists wrote their final collective manifesto, the New Realism. Here, they define the New Realism simply as what they had been trying to provide for themselves and their viewers, a new reality based on universal humanism for all people for a new era. Then, in 1946, the artists made their first attempt at international collaboration, sending the New Realism as part of an unsuccessful exhibition proposal to none other than the Museum of Modern Art in New York, along with a gift of nearly 50 works on paper. Asger Jorn's 8 lithographs portfolio, one of which you see here, was included in the MoMA gift, and it's in the exhibition across the way. As is characteristic of the donated works, with their insistence on dreamlike evocations as well as low art forms and materials, which heeded little concern for rules of composition, seriousness, or finish, this challenging of traditional notions of art was reflective of the creative freedom the artists espoused in the New Realism and representative of their humanist aims. In the text, the artists had explicitly linked their defiance of political dogma during the war with their stylistic development. They wrote, quote, "The free experimental art rose to importance as an opposition to the Nazi view of art. Danish artists and connoisseurs regarded artistic freedom as symbolic of the resistance against Nazi art ideology within Danish territory. Though no one knew during the occupation if and when actual persecution might happen, our artists have been able to maintain their free will in independent creative work. All this time, this art was inspired and fertilized by the fight for cultural values," end quote. While neither critics nor National Socialists recognized the polemical import behind Helhesten, its artists certainly did. Egil Jacobsen later explained, "We became an art movement. As painters, we wished to discover and express what was hidden within us, just as it is art that keeps society alive. We felt that when people understood our pictures, it would change society, make society warmer, more human, more tolerant," end quote. Such statements with their humanistic underpinning challenge the traditional understanding of Helhesten as a self-proclaimed provisional movement during a period of nation for artists who were then launched in the Cobra period. It was the artists themselves who recognized the crucial importance of Helhesten and its living aesthetic that killed with kindness and transformed the aesthetic characteristics of earlier styles into indicators of absurdity, humor, and fantasy. As we hope to demonstrate with the exhibition, the Helhesten period served as the major catalyst for these artists' development of gestural abstraction, collective art making, and exploration of the vernacular and play as critical practices, ultimately anticipating later post-war avant-garde endeavors to reintegrate art and artists into the public sphere as a stimulus for human interaction by several years. And today, we acknowledge their remarkable contribution to creative freedom. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so questions? Does anybody have any questions?
Kerry, thank you on that. I have a question about, it seems to me that this group of courageous Danish artists were in a way a microcosm of a society in Denmark that was able to mobilize and communicate and successfully transport 8,000 Jews in a matter of 1 month.
It's a very good point. I mean, Denmark is very homogenous. They share a very distinct social identity, and there's definitely something to be said for growing out of this social democratic tradition that these Danes could mobilize not only the saving of an entire population, but also an avant-garde group activity. And it's also why I think their resistance efforts became so effective so quickly in the two major groups.
You mentioned the communication between this group and the gods of European art there, Kandinsky and the Blue Rider and all. How about the gods of American art? Was there communication between them at the time?
No communication whatsoever until after the war. So it makes it pretty remarkable that they were doing very similar. I mean, it's very different as well, because, of course, the abstract expressionists would go into complete abstraction, whereas the Danish artists were very much interested in semi-figuration, and they wouldn't give that up. But no, they didn't really know of one another till after the war.
Any other questions?
I'd just like to ask how many of them were women?
Oh, everybody asks me that. Like most mid-century arts groups, not many. But there were women, and Elsa Alfeld, who had the points, the kind of glacial landscapes, she was very much part of the group. Sonia Fairlow Mancoba, who later became a member of Cobra, was involved with this group. Elsa Fisher Hansen, which you saw painting the tondo to go in front of the tent, was part of this group. But the majority who contributed to the journal, for example, were men. Yeah.
Any other questions? Anybody?
Kerry,
Oh, here, Lonnie.
how can art be a form of resistance?
Well, I think we have the case here. any act of creativity or creative freedom during a time when you're told not to do anything to upset anyone else is an act of creative freedom or of resistance. And not using humor is a way to resist certain kinds of dogma. And I think we see it today in a lot of things that are going on in the world. Images matter. Images can be very powerful. And we see that with these artists as well. I mean, history repeats itself over and over. And so just because we're the first ones really recognizing this group doesn't mean what they did wasn't important or wasn't resistance. It was, by the very fact that I'm standing here today talking to you about them.